Hello, I'm Martha Engber, host of Vigilant Positivity, a blog and podcast meant to decrease polarization by uniting Americans through civil discussion that leads to common ground. Thanks to those of you who've tuned in. Please feel free to subscribe and grow the Common Ground movement. Every month, I try to do a citizen spotlight to cast a light on other Americans on both sides of the political spectrum who are working hard to decrease polarization. Today, I have not one, but two American citizens. I'll be talking with both of them. They're both members of Braver Angels, the largest national nonprofit working to reduce polarization through civil discussion and action. They're Katherine Cadwell and Steve Saltwick. Hello, Katherine and Steve.
Well, hello.
Hi, Martha. Happy to be here.
Katherine is the blue co-chair of Braver Angels in Vermont. She recently retired from a 40-year career teaching high school history and philosophy. She continues to work with teachers and students in methods that encourage civil discourse and student-driven dialogue. In a TEDx talk, she expanded on the topic, stating what she's learned over the years, that those who do the work do the learning, a foundational concept for healthy democracy. She's also a co-founder of PH International, a nonprofit organization working to build a strong global community by fostering civic engagement, cross-cultural learning, and increased opportunities in the digital age. Steve is a senior fellow of Braver Angels, focusing on national key strategic initiatives for advancing its mission. Besides co-founding the Office of Field Operations for the organization, he's a co-creator of BA's new Citizen-Led Solutions program, in which local alliances help solve issues in their communities by fostering dialogue and action. Trained in neuroscience, his work in BA has been profiled in the Wall Street Journal, Deseret News, the Austin PBS station, and Fox News in Austin. As you might have guessed, Steve lives in Austin and is the founding conservative co-chair of the Braver Angels of Central Texas Alliance. So let's get started. The terms of liberal and conservative have become so polarizing that we Americans often throw out the terms as insult. You're a liberal. You're a conservative. Yet it occurred to me that I don't really know what those terms mean as defined by the people who identify with them. If you're liberal, what does that mean to you? If you're a conservative, what does that mean to you? As I ask questions, I'll go back and forth between who answers first. And I should point out for our audience that you both will be speaking for yourselves rather than everyone in your respective political parties. So, Katherine, we'll start with you. What terms do you use to identify yourself politically? Liberal, Democrat, progressive?
Martha, that is a question that is causing me to reflect. As a career high school teacher teaching about the development of political parties and their leanings, we always used to define liberal as those individuals who believed in an expansive role of government, a larger role for government, where if you're conservative, you want to conserve or keep small, stay the same for a smaller role of the federal government. Um, so myself, I have always felt that government has a role to play in helping those who may not be able to help themselves. I believe in a more expansive role for federal government in terms of social support systems. I have seen myself as a Democrat, probably um, a, 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 a Democrat in terms of social movements and priorities, but I identify oftentimes with a moderate uh, fiscal management that many moderate Republicans also identify with. What's interesting is we also have left and right here, which have also become blurred and very, very polarizing. Maybe we can talk about that later. That's also a tricky label now.
So you're saying that combining some things that are conservative and some things that are liberal and creating that new term purple.
Mhm.
You're neither necessarily all
Yeah.
blue or all red, but instead mix.
Well, I really, I'm the blue leaning co-chair of Vermont. Vermont, as many of your listeners will know, well, this is Bernie land where we are here, and this is a bright blue state. Um, I do see myself as a liberal blue Democrat. There's a strong movement in Vermont, the progressives. I identify with many of their agendas, not all of their agendas. I don't see myself on the far end of the political spectrum. Um, but I'm a fiscal conservative in some of my beliefs.
And
It
Steve,
really is hard to identify, isn't it?
that's why we're here. So, Steve, what terms do you use for yourself?
Well, Martha, I'm a conservative, and I mean that kind of in the traditional sense of the word. Conservatives want to conserve, right? And I think there's an awful lot of good in America that we ought to conserve. I mean, basic liberty for people to do what they want to do, because I think when people do that, they create fantastic communities of great wealth and all sorts of accomplishments, things like that. I think that's a good thing. But I also want to conserve things like, we should conserve our environment and we should be gentle with the earth. And we should be conservative, I think, in our approach to fiscal problems. Um, any family has to manage to a budget. You got to watch what you're putting on the credit card and all that. And so when I apply those kind of principles to government, I tend to favor smaller government that is conservatively managed. They watch what their credit card does. Yes, we need to be generous and compassionate with people, but there's only so much we can spend, and I believe we have a spending problem. So I believe those are kind of traditional conservative roles. Um, but the term, as you say, often gets merged with MAGA, Make America Great Again, or red, or whatever. Um, that gets into a very long discussion, so I'm not going to do it in my answer today, right? But I think the big thing for a conservative in my fashion is limited government, because I do not think government has been shown to be effective and efficient in many instances. The private sector can do better, um, but it's to conserve the good things we have in the United States, recognizing that there's a whole lot of work we have to do. I am not claiming the United States is perfect or can get perfect. No, no endeavor of human beings can get perfect. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's an awful lot right with America. And as Bill Clinton said, there's nothing wrong with America that what's right with America can fix. So that's where I'm coming from.
Well, let's start with you on this next round, Steve. Finish this sentence. What those terms to me personally, what the term of conservative means to me personally is, and give your, I guess, values underlying conservatism. For example, compassion would be a value and that kind of thing. What do what is underneath it for you personally?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So,
Values.
yeah, I mean, personal responsibility is one thing, right? I mean, I think that each of us, when we get to be an adult, has a personal responsibility to provide for yourself and your family, um, to work if you're able to work, things like that, to contribute to our country, to do your duty as a citizen. So serve on a jury or obey the law or, that kind of stuff. So personal responsibility, I think, is really big. Um, Compassion, which to me means ensuring that we do have a safety net for those that are in need. I mean, there are people who can't work. There are people, my father died when I was 19, and so we got Social Security help because my mother had to go back to work and as a teacher and all that, right? And it was very helpful, the government assistance. But that's got to be balanced with how much spending are we doing? I mean, the debt is too big. We need to be conservative about managing that. Um, so fiscal responsibility, personal responsibility, uh, using the system to make sure that hopefully the quality of life for all Americans, continues to rise over time. And over time, it has. So, I think those are mainly the things. I guess the final thing I would say is I have an inherent skepticism for promises of systems that get close to utopia, right? I mean, there are a lot of times various programs are proposed that's going to fix a problem, right? I don't, I mean, I think we can we can reduce the size of the problem. We can make things better, but it's never going to be perfect. We're always going to go back and forth in terms of what we need to do. So I think that's another thing of conservatism is, a healthy skepticism on exactly what major programs can do, especially from government. Yeah.
So personal and financial responsibility, compassion, and really watching closely the promises that regarding government
Yeah,
programs.
skeptical, utopian-like promises of programs that are going to quote fix some major problem.
Now, Catherine, what are the values that are underlying liberal for you?
Well, Steve, it's really interesting listening to you. Thank you for sharing those. And I do share the idea of compassion. Um, compassion, uh, I feel a deep sense of responsibility, um, and the responsibility to develop the American community, um, by making the promise of America equally available to all. When I think of the liberal viewpoint, I believe this deeply personally. I do believe in diversity. I do believe in equity. I do believe in inclusion. This DEI, which has tagged and has somehow been given a very negative association in the last several years, certainly by the current administration. And this is really informed by my work day to day for 40 years teaching high school kids in a very rural community in Vermont. I believe that government has the responsibility to help those who can't help themselves. Steve mentioned that. I agree with you, Steve, on that. Um, I also believe that that this idea of strong community, there's a need for government support. There's a need for fiscal support. There's a need for social supports. So the sense of supporting the common. I really believe that American democracy is not going to flourish unless we all flourish. Democracy is only as healthy as its weakest voice, and we have many weak voices. We have many marginalized citizens who can't participate for a variety of reasons, financial, social, emotional, to participate in our democratic society. So we need to bring those voices forward. The last thing I'll say is the growing rich-poor gap, which we have in the country, has led to a greater need to address this gap. And I think government has a role to play in addressing this gap.
Well, I think it's interesting that both of you mentioned lifting people up, that we all do better. We want everybody to do better because then we'll do better as a country. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well,
For me, you are.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, Martha, right? In that I mentioned I was skeptical of utopian-like promises and things like that. I think if we take and in my mind, a compassionate view is a compassionate view of the situation as it is. There is no country on earth that has 100% of their citizens engaging in goodwill, trying to use the benefit of the country. There's always people that will break the law. There will always people be that game the system, right? And in fact, I'm a psychologist by training, a neuroscientist by training, right? Um, and if you look at the science of cooperation, if you study this in primates like chimpanzees, which endow many human traits, as it turns out, that if you study cooperation amongst groups of people, the one thing you've got to have for cooperation to stay is punishment of free riders. If a free rider who's kind of taking advantage of the group is allowed to participate, and this is in primate studies as well as human studies, then cooperation amongst the group declines. So, I want everyone to have an equal opportunity. I want everyone that wants to work hard to participate in the American system to be able to get ahead, to have a decent life, all of that, right? But at the same time, I also recognize there will be a percentage of people, and we can argue what that percentage is, right? Of people that are going to game the system, they're going to claim victim status, they're going to defraud government programs, and there's a whole lot of reporting about that these days, right? Um, and we just have to be aware of that, right? I mean, and those are people that are not playing by the rules. I don't know if I'm saying that right or not, right? But the system shouldn't be bending over backwards to help those guys because they're not playing fair in the system. But if people want to engage in the system, absolutely they should have equal opportunity, and absolutely they should have their shot at the American dream, whatever that is, right?
Well, it's very interesting. This will lead us into the next one, which is, and I'll start with you, Catherine, is when you hear the term liberal used by people on the opposite side of the political spectrum, which includes right-leaning media, um,
Hmm.
what do you think the term means to them? How is it being used? And what do you think, if I hear liberal used on, say, Fox News or something, how is it being used? And are the um, uh, what is the implication?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I thought a lot about that, because uh, when we sometimes hear the term, oh, New England liberal intellectuals, the group of people that are highly educated, well off financially, privileged. Sometimes I feel that that term liberal is used in a way that's sort of pejorative, with the connotations, oh, you think you know everything. You're highly educated. You think you're better than anyone else, and your ideas are out to lunch. They're too extreme. They're not grounded in reality. You live in the world of ideas, not grounded in the world of, you don't have your 2 feet on the ground. And I've heard that. I've heard that a lot. Um, it's so. I can feel how these are arrows that are slung back and forth across the political divide. Fantastic question.
And how about it for you, Steve? When you hear conservative used by left-leaning people, how are you interpreting their use of the term?
Well, I mean, it's a stereotype, right? I mean, it's the classic thing we deal since we're both in Braver Angels, right? I mean, we're all in Braver Angels. It's kind of like, these stereotypes that are being cast as aspersions, pretty much like Catherine said. So conservative, if I hear that on MSNBC, I'm going to say, okay, they're saying I'm bigoted. I don't care about people. I don't care about poor people. I want government to go away, and let's just all do this kind of stuff. I'm uneducated. I'm a racist. all that kind of stuff. So now I don't always hear that, and it's not true, and certainly not in all the media and all that, but it is. I think the bias of the media in general can be shown to be left-leaning. I mean, I think most media, by research criteria, can be shown to be left-leaning, and they tend to use the term as, these guys are uneducated and they're uncaring, and all they want to do is hoard their money, and let everybody else, decline, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And what we're seeing, I guess, with both of you is you're seeing a lot of similarities in terms of values. So let's go to the next one, dig a little deeper. The next question is, how deeply do you identify with the respective political titles? For example, of all the roles you have in your life, a spouse, offspring, sibling, parent, volunteer, neighbor, citizen, where does that political title fall? First, third, 10th? If you were making a list of all your roles in life, where would your political leaning title be?
You mean like, excuse me for asking, meaning
And
like
we'll
I'm a
start with
liberal
you.
or I'm a conservative?
So,
Or
no, yes, so Steve, we'll start with you. For example, out of all of you, if you were to make a list of 10 roles that you play in life, a neuroscientist, where would conservative be on that list? Would it be high on your list? Would it be low on your list? Where would it be?
Well, I mean, there's probably two answers to that question, right? I mean, in terms of my family, right, it'd probably be, I mean, I think you should pay attention to your health. I mean, my priorities are my health, my family, my mission, where my mission is Braver Angels and also volunteering and travel. I love to travel, right?
Okay.
So, uh, in terms of our family, right, I try to run that on conservative principles. So, we have minimal debt. Um, we have been fortunate. I have been fortunate in my work, although I started out, pretty poor. Um, so that's one answer personally, right? The second answer is more along the lines of what do I do as I volunteer? Since I'm retired, I'm a big believer in that I do want to give back. You need to do something. If you don't structure your life in retirement, you're going to go absolutely crazy. So that's one of the reasons I volunteer for Braver Angels. And I carry that label into Braver Angels, very high, because I think it's the essence of Braver Angels is to get people with vastly different political viewpoints to, step out of the outrage cycle, work together, and show that we can make our communities better. So pretty high there, right? Um, in terms of my public volunteering, but it's certainly below, my health and taking care of my family and things like that. I mean, in my personal life. Sorry if I
No,
blathered
that's
on.
good.
Sorry if I
Very good.
blathered on there, Martha.
No worries. That was a very good answer. Catherine, how about you?
Steve, thanks for going first because I jotted a few things down
You're welcome, Martha.
while you were talking. Um, I love this question. So for me, I think I would say I identify, as a spouse, as a parent, as a teacher, then as a community member, then as an activist, and then as a liberal. So it's certainly in my top six. But my my calling in life and my family relations, and I would put friend in there, and that probably would go above liberal. So it's part of who I am, but it is not only who I am.
Hmm, very good. Well, let's start with you, Catherine. Do you think your basic personality contributes to your political leaning? And if so, how?
I I think I know that my political leanings were shaped by uh, experiences that I've had growing up, whether it's a personality or not. I do think so, but I don't think one's political leanings are dependent upon their personalities.
So that was
So
my next one. So you might as well, you're on the right track in terms of, so you think it's more related to your upbringing.
absolutely. I mean, I think maybe because um, if politics in Greek, it means the science of the city. How do we feel about how our cities should be run? Those are opinions. I don't think they're grounded in personality. I think they're shaped by all sorts of things. It's a values question, but certainly I feel that my political leanings, my sensibility, sense of a duty that we all have a duty and a responsibility to be active in shaping our democracy, that was shaped in my childhood. I mean, I'm happy to speak about that, but I don't think it's a personality thing.
Well, how about you, Steve? That's the question. How much is nature and nurture, or personality
Well,
or upbringing?
yeah, yeah. I'll tell you a personal story, but first let me put my neuroscience hat on. Every once in a while, there's an article that comes out that says the brains of conservatives and liberals are different. And in general, those are fake news articles, right? I mean, um, there's a series of people in the media, not all, but some, that are kind of conflict entrepreneurs. They write a headline the right way and all that kind of stuff. I'm kind of with Catherine in that I think in general it's mostly nurture, right? I mean, when I was little, I remember going to vote with my mother, and that was back in the day when they had big, bulky voting machines, and I got to pull the lever to close the curtain, and she flipped all these levers to vote and all that, and then I got to pull this big red thing that cast the ballot and all that. And I'll never forget, I asked my mother, so how do you decide who to vote for? How do you decide which one of these little levers to pull? And this was at the time of John F. Kennedy's election. And I'll never forget this. My mother goes, well, I vote for the cute guy, right? So I thought, oh, okay. And so I was apolitical, really, um, for quite a while. And then I remember I was out in California, Martha. We had two children in elementary school, and we were on a play. I'll never forget this. We were on a park. They were playing in a playground, and all of a sudden it hit me, these kids are going to have to go to college someday, and we're going to have to pay for that. I mean, and so we altered our spending patterns then and there. And one thing I was very proud of doing, we as a family, is our children graduated college with no debt. Now that was tough, and that was tough, right? Um, so I mean that was a series of experiences, right? Um, and they turned out well. I was really glad that they didn't have student debt. I mean, I think it's absolutely insane what the debt situation is for students. I mean, there's a variety of reasons for that, but so I think to me it was life experiences and dealing with those challenges in terms of either surmounting them or not. That's where I'd be coming from.
Very interesting. Let's start with you, Steve, because it sounds like you both have a lot in common in terms of values. Uh, Having compassion, having respect for your fellow Americans, uh, definitely both of you believing in hard work. So I'm having trouble seeing the differences between conservative and liberals. So, Steve, that's my question for you. What do you see are the main differences between
Well, I mean, I think
conservatives
in
and
the
liberals?
scope, Martha, in the scope of this podcast, right? I think one of the main differences would be, let's take a social challenge, right? I mean, um, I'll give you a good example, homelessness, right? And affordable housing, right? So, um, I think a conservative, I mean, there's a kind of a conservative and liberal viewpoint to these things. And if I'm misrepresenting the liberal view, Catherine, I'm sure you'll keep me honest, right? But oftentimes you will hear as communities try to address this very significant problem, right? Is that, well, there needs to be a government program for that. We ought to do the housing first. We need to get these people off the street and stick them in housing, and that'll solve the problem. And it hasn't worked out that way. You compare that to what I would argue is a conservative approach, and we have an excellent example of that here in Austin, Texas, called Community First, which is not a government program. They take no federal dollars, they take no state dollars, they take no city dollars. They run it as a community. So what these Community First guys would do, and I used to volunteer for them, is that homelessness is a result of a sudden and catastrophic loss of community. So they get these little tiny homes, and people can live there, but they have to pay rent. If they don't pay rent, they're evicted. There are ground rules on, how you behave in the community. What you do in your tiny home is whatever you want to do in your tiny home, in one sense, right? But there's, I mean, 1,000 or 1,500 people living in this community now, something that is approaching a critical mass of getting the homeless, long-term homeless, off the streets in Austin, Texas. And they can live there forever. And this is not a government program, and this is something they really struggled with people that really had compassion and care for this thing, but they explicitly didn't take government money because government money came with strings. They would have to do this, or they would have to do that, right? So I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that I think most liberals and conservatives have common values, right? We want America to thrive. We want our fellow citizens to thrive, right? We want to do the right thing by America, and we were willing to invest in America. The differences come with, well, how do you solve the problems,
Right.
right?
Right.
Is it another government program, or is it something the citizens are going to get together and try to do using government where it's appropriate, right? But it's not centered on the government. It's really centered on citizens. And that's why I got into this whole citizen-led solution thing in Braver Angels, right? But it's skeptical of government, right? And it's focused and centered on citizens taking action. I think
Well,
that's one of the major differences.
before I go to you, Catherine, is it possible that one of the problems is that certain approaches are labeled conservative or liberal? Because, for example, what you're describing is what I have heard and kind of what I believe in. And I consider myself an independent. In other words, that sounds reasonable to me. But sometimes just labeling something, oh, this is the conservative approach or this is the liberal approach is the problem. In other words, you're talking about stereotypes of liberals perhaps always wanting government to come in to the rescue. And I think that might be a stereotype. So in other words, do you think the problem is in the labeling?
Are you asking Steve?
I was asking Steve just as a
Okay,
follow-up.
Oh, I thought
Okay.
you were
Okay.
asking Catherine. I'm sorry.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
sorry
go
about
ahead.
that.
Sorry, no. All right. I'm waiting for Catherine to say something. All right. Well, labeling, I think labeling does get thrown around. I mean, absolutely it gets thrown around. And I think the people that are throwing it around typically are, conflict entrepreneurs. They're people that are trying to drive differences amongst groups of people. Um, it is used in a way that maximizes the stereotyping of things and all of that. So I think that, so if I understood you correctly, Martha, right, one way of making progress on some of this is just to talk about it without the labels, right? What are you proposing we do? And is there any evidence that says if we do it this way versus that way, we're going to get better outcomes, right? I mean, Because at the end of the day, who cares whether it's quote conservative or liberal, right? Do we get a decent outcome? And is there evidence to support that outcome?
So,
Okay.
Catherine, we'll throw that to you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Steve, I really agree with your the last part of what you were saying in terms of your analysis. As human beings, I think someone who care deeply about um, providing the opportunity for the American dream for all citizens. I would think a conservative, as you're describing, certainly as yourself, and a liberal, as I'm describing, certainly as myself. We agree on the goals, right? So I completely agree with you. It's not the goals, it's the approach, I think, which is difficult. And I love what you said, Martha, using the term reasonable. So may I use some specific examples that highlight, I mean, why reasonable is a good adjective to use maybe rather than conservative or liberal. Um, so when you talk about the current administration's initiatives to shrink the size of the government, you want to ask, what is this reasonable? Is it a value added? Does it help citizens? Is it going to help people in their daily life? So I would say some of the recent initiatives are not reasonable. When the current president gets on the horn at a conference and says, um, uh, we shouldn't have Medicaid, we shouldn't have daycare, we shouldn't have these sorts of supports. The states have to handle it themselves. It's not reasonable, it's not feasible, it's not reasonable to cut health care, to not regulate healthcare when people can't afford to go to the doctor. There's a difference between philosophy and achievable results. So I see a lot of conflict, a lot of differences in how we approach common problems. And I think that's where people obviously take different opinions. For example, immigration is another easy one. There are very few people who don't think there's a problem with immigration. The question is, what is the problem and how do we fix it? And I don't think it's reasonable how this current administration has deported people, sent them to third world countries, and the courts are now rolling back a lot of that. Reasonable is a great word to use.
So I'll throw that follow-up question at you again, Catherine, is because I think it's the same one that I gave to Steve, is that maybe in this situation, it's a matter of labeling as well. My guess is that if you ask conservatives and liberals alike, do you appreciate a reasonable approach with a clear goal that benefits everybody? My guess is people will say yes. So, in other words, that perhaps labeling this administration is truly conservative isn't quite right if most Americans would agree to what I just said. What do you think?
Well, I think we're playing a wordsmith game here. It doesn't really matter what labels they are. If we use liberal, conservative, left, right, red, blue, day, night, when it gets into the judgment of good, bad, that are associated with that, that's what brings up the fire. That's what causes the polarization. Um, and that's where, because people naturally have different views about how we should reach the solution to these problems. Um, and I think it's interesting that Braver Angels is now considering eliminating using the terms red and blue because they have become so polarized. So when we talk about, well, what would be reasonable? Reasonable for who? How is that decision made? Reasonable benefits for whom? That's where the weeds are.
So this is interesting because it relates, I think, to your neuroscience background, my guess, Steve. So, but we'll start with you. Braver Angels, I should say, for people, self-selects for people who want to communicate with people of differing viewpoints. If you don't want to, you're not probably going to join Braver Angels, right? So that means both of you are of that first ilk. That noted, you seem to have a lot in common. So, where do you think the polarization between conservatives and liberals resides? Do you think it's really between conservative or liberals, or somewhere in between, the conflict entrepreneurs, for example, or what? Because you had mentioned it's when you talk about good and bad, which touches on, oh, are they moral or not moral? Then, but is the problem. So where do you think polarization resides, Catherine?
Oh, me. Okay.
Yeah.
I think polarization, there've always been political parties. There've always been different points of view. I think the current issue of political polarization in this country is coming um, because people identify other individuals with positions. When people are identified with a position, and you can't separate Martha from her position or Steve from his position, then we have people passing judgments on people because of their positions. And so that's when politics really becomes personal. Um, and I was giving a Braver Angels workshop actually at the Vermont legislature a couple days ago, and one of the representatives stood up and she said, we used to go to dinner together. We'd work all day, we'd argue in the committee, we'd take a floor vote, and then we would go out to dinner, or then we would see a movie, and that doesn't happen anymore. And this rep was saying, we need to get this back. So, I think there's been a cleft because people take everything personally. And I will say, I don't think there are a lot of role models from our nationally elected politicians that foster the sort of civil discourse that we encourage in Braver Angels. And as a teacher, I can tell you when you're working with high school kids and they hear and they read and they see video clips of elected officials shaming, blaming, marginalizing, that only sets up the wrong role models as to how it's okay to treat other people. That's where
Well,
I
Steve,
think it resides.
thank you. Thank you. Very good. It's interesting to have your teaching experience because you see it at the young level, and that, of course, filters up to people as they get older. But Steve, what do you think in terms of where do you think polarization resides? If we have a lot in common already, where do you think it resides?
Well, I mean, now that's a long question, right? In one sense, right? But I think that I'll kind of go off a little bit on what Catherine said, right? I mean, it's like the legislatures that don't go out and have dinner anymore, right? We're we're I think one of the things that's happening is that all of us are quite concerned about the state of America today. I believe Pew just did a study, and something like 80% of all Americans think we're in a political crisis, right? Now, we disagree on what that crisis is, but everybody thinks, okay, we got a real problem in River City here. Um, there are significant differences. While we share values, there are very significant differences in the way that a conservative and a liberal would implement a solution. We kind of talked about that. Now, that gives contra entrepreneurs an entree to really begin uh, to, to maximize the divide on something like that. So one of the reasons I got into this citizen-led solution stuff, I think Braver Angels is not just about talking to the other side, it's doing with the other side something to make our communities better. And one thing that I am firmly believing in is that we can't fall prey to the tantalizing thing of trying to fix our national politics. National politics are toxic right now. And it's not just Trump. I mean, you can look all through the national politics and find people that are, I mean, they're just crazy, right? Um, and so the point is, if we, but I know from personal experience that I can get together. I mean, I had lunch with a very, very blue progressive woman down here in Austin, and she knows I'm a conservative. And this last go round, I voted for Trump and all that, right? And she just couldn't understand that. Um, and it was like, well, wait a minute. Would Is there some problem in your community that's driving you crazy? And this woman goes, yes, bike lanes. And I said, great. Would you work with a Trump voter if we got together and tried to come up with a solution to bike lanes in your neighborhood? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So the the national political situation is toxic, right, on all sides. So I guess to your question, that to me is where the fertile ground of polarization is, right? And Trump is terrible at it. I mean, I voted for the guy, but he ought to keep his mouth shut. His character is terrible. He's completely unqualified to be president on the basis of character and style. But there's been a lot of presidents that have been problems. But when we get down to the system, Washington is only going to change when citizens rediscover the fact that people are very different, a Trump voter and a Harris voter can still get together and work on bike lanes. And if we can do bike lanes, maybe we can do something in the state. And if we can do something in the state, maybe we can do something nationally, right? So, so in my impression, Martha, the national scene has come to dominate everything. And Catherine, to your point, I mean, you're in New England, right? When Alexis de Tocqueville came and did a tour of New England, what he was blown away with was not the national government of the United States, it was the town hall meetings of New England where they were arguing about potholes, right? But they fixed the potholes, right? Where in France, right, they still had tons of potholes because everybody was arguing about the king, that kind of stuff. We've got to get back to that.
So
We've
what
got to
you're
get
saying is
back to
polarization is where there is no opportunity to regularly meet with one another, whereas depolarization lies in getting together to regularly talk with one another.
Well, I mean,
Is that what
if
I'm
I
hearing?
could, right, if I could jump in, right, I mean, I do think whatever we can do to personalize the other person so that the other person, kind of like what you were saying, Martha, the other person is not a conservative or a liberal. They're a person. They're Catherine, right, who happens to be blue leaning or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
And Catherine and I have worked together on some project, or we, both have shared beliefs and values and all that, that mean that, Catherine and I are not going to label one another, which sets the stage for Catherine and I can actually do something together.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's really important to get beyond the stereotype. I mean, Bravery Angels is all about this, right? Get beyond the stereotype. Make sure we give the dignity to other people we are talking to so that ultimately we can collaborate on action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's beautifully said. And that's an argument for keeping, the New England and the Vermont town meeting where citizens come one day a year. We talk with one another, we debate legislation face to face and pass laws and initiatives proposed for our town. So I think you did just a lovely job explaining why it's important to model local democracy.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, if I
Well,
could, Martha, there's one other analogy I'd like to throw in,
hmm,
right? Um, Back when Catherine said, and she's from New England, so this is the birth of this, right? Is that the town hall kind of had citizen as the highest office in the land. It wasn't the governor. It was the way the town worked was the citizens got together and solved problems. You can look at the civil rights movement and study something called Rosenwald schools, which were black communities with seed money from one of the founders of Sears Roebuck, built schools and had black community schools that John Lewis and Mary Angelou and a lot of others. There were 5,000 of these things through the South, and they were excellent. And it was community generated, right? Um, that's the key here. I mean, some people, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but I think some people view government as almost a vending machine. You feed in votes and you get out goodies, right? That's not, in my opinion, the way government works. Government is there to ensure our rights, make sure we're not invaded by somebody, all that kind of stuff, and then assist citizens getting together to solve problems, right? And where it makes sense for government to run those things, great. Where it makes sense for citizens to run those things, government doesn't take it over, the citizens do. But the citizens have got to get back to this thing of town hall meetings, having dinner together, not throwing labels around and not expecting a government vending machine to dispense goodies, to solve all this stuff because it just, in my opinion, doesn't work.
Well, I have a last question for you all. And so, my personal benchmark for whether we're overcoming polarization is if we Americans, while identifying with one political party, would consider voting for a candidate of the opposite party solely based on that person's ideas for America, especially in something like presidential election. So I think we're on you, Steve. Steve, is that the attitude you feel like you could have in the future or you
Absolutely.
have
No,
now?
sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. I mean, I tend to vote Republican, but I evaluate, I hope, I don't vote for on party, right? I mean, a national election for president, let's say, is a vote between typically two people, right? And I'm going to vote for the person I think um, I mean, and if we're being honest, I'm the vote for the person that's least bad, right? I mean, you know, right? And I mean, so by voting for the least bad person, I'm hoping for the best outcome for America.
Oh,
How
oh,
about you, Catherine?
I'm just smiling that, that it's quite a comment on American politics, but I hear what you're saying. Um, I I would vote for, I would have and will vote for the person um, whose whose articulated values are similar to mine. It doesn't matter what party affiliation he or she or they have. Someone I feel I could trust, is honest, is respectful, and whose values they espouse the values that I believe in. It doesn't, the label is not as important to me.
Well, that you guys are very enlightened. That's great because I have to assume that people who are watching this or might be saying, "I would never vote for
Well,
them."
so may I
So that's
may
yeah.
I just share one quick thing, and this might resonate with people too. I've had friends of mine and say, would you ever let your daughter marry a Republican?
Yeah.
I'm like, whoever my daughter marries, it's not my choice, it's her choice. We're talking about people, right? And this is what Steve was referring to. So, those are the people to people relationships we need to mend. And we need to sort of regrow like new grass coming up. And have that grow taller than the weeds that is choking our personal conversations. Um, and that's the work of Braver Angels that we're engaged in.
Well, I completely am so happy and grateful that you were able to talk with me today. It's been really fascinating, this whole journey toward finding differences and finding commonality. So thank you both.
Our pleasure.
Hey, yeah, it was super fun. Steve, nice to meet you, and Martha, you too, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks again to those of you who listened to this episode. You can find a post and a transcript of today's interview on my blog, Vigilant Positivity, on both WordPress and Substack. Please join our cause. All right, good.